You're listening to Trace Hunt Radio. We explore the darkest chapters of true crime, unsolved mysteries, cold cases, and the twisted minds behind them. Follow the blood, chase the clues, uncover the truth. Stay sharp. The hunt begins now. In the early spring of 1991, Pinebridge was the kind of town that disappeared under fog by 5 in the evening. It was nestled between cedar forests and old railway tracks on the northern edge of Washington state, one of those postcard places where people didn't lock their doors, and neighbors still dropped off pies just because. But on the night of March 11th, that illusion cracked for the first time. It began with a phone call, brief, panicked, and nearly unintelligible, from a woman named Eleanor Keats, 34, a single school librarian living on the edge of town. When the police arrived, they found her trembling in her hallway, barefoot and gripping a carving knife. She told them she had woken around 2:40 a.m. to the sound of breathing deep, measured in her bedroom. The sliding window was open. Muddy bootprints crossed the carpet. Nothing had been stolen, but the police did find something odd. A single pine cone, placed on her nightstand, and written in ballpoint pen on the back of a receipt tucked under it, 2 words, "Still here." Eleanor moved out of town 3 weeks later. Her report was quietly filed as possible home intrusion. Most assumed it was nerves, a nightmare exaggerated, but within 5 months, it happened again. This time, the victim was Kimberly Voss, a 29-year-old waitress who worked the late shift at a local diner. She didn't survive to make a phone call. Her neighbor found her the next morning when she failed to pick up her niece for school. Kimberly was discovered face down in her bedroom, wrists tied with nylon rope. No forced entry, no fingerprints, but on the pillow next to her head, placed neatly, was a single pine cone, again with a message. Tried to whisper. The town reeled, but the investigation stalled. There were no witnesses, no signs of struggle. Toxicology was clean, and without any sexual assault or robbery, the motive seemed elusive. The media ran a brief story, "Mystery Death in Pinebridge." It faded in a week, but for the residents, the paranoia began to fester. Between 1991 and 1996, 7 more women, all living alone in the Pinebridge area, reported similar intrusions. Most woke to find their doors unlocked or windows ajar. One described a shadow with a breath like wind. 2 women heard a voice whispering from the hallway, though none could recall what was said. In each case, nothing was taken. No physical assault, just the pine cone, the note, the signature presence, always written in the same thin cursive hand. Local police dubbed the unknown figure the Whisperer. By late 1997, the intrusions had escalated. Susan Bellamy, 42, nurse working nights at St. Luke's, never came home from her shift. Her body was found 5 days later in the woods beyond town, laid out as if sleeping. No bruising, no blood, no sign of resistance. Only a pine cone placed over her sternum. The FBI finally stepped in. A task force was formed, and behavioral profilers were brought in. According to their analysis, the killer was organized, methodical, and deeply ritualistic. He knew his victims. He stalked them for weeks, and he was evolving. Then, in 1998, the Whisperer vanished. No more pine cones, no more whispers. It was as if he had disappeared into the trees. Nearly a decade passed. The town moved on, or tried to. New families came in. A couple of chain restaurants opened by the highway. The fog rolled on as always. Then, in February 2007, the past clawed its way back. The body of Eleanor Keats, now 50, and living under a different name in Tacoma, was found murdered in her apartment. She had been strangled with a nylon cord. There was no forced entry, no witnesses, but there was a pine cone taped to the ceiling above her body. Police found a torn piece of notebook paper with 3 words written in the same handwriting from years ago: "I never left." Detectives went back to the old files. The same patterns emerged. 11 women, different years, same signature. Forensic technology had changed since the 90s. DNA testing was faster, more precise. Fibers were reanalyzed. The rope from the Keats crime scene matched those used in the 1990s cases. And most chilling of all, a partial DNA profile was extracted from under her fingernails, likely left as she tried to fight him off. They ran the DNA through CODIS. Nothing, no match. But one of the younger detectives had a different idea. He brought up a new tool, one that had led to an arrest in California not long before. Genetic genealogy. They uploaded the partial DNA profile to a public database where people voluntarily submitted samples for ancestry tracing. The match wasn't direct, but it hit on 3 distant relatives. With careful triangulation, they built a family tree, and at the root of it was a man named Raymond Hale, 61, retired fire department captain, divorced, no children, lived alone in a small cabin in the Idaho woods. By the time surveillance began, Hale was already showing signs of caution. He didn't speak to neighbors. He paid in cash. His mail was picked up wearing gloves. But one night in April, he tossed a used coffee cup into a trash bin outside a gas station in Missoula. The cup went straight to the lab. DNA, 100% match. The arrest was silent. Hale didn't speak a word. In his home, they found a wooden box. Inside, 19 pine cones, each labeled with initials and dates. Beneath the box was a single page of lined notebook paper, with the phrase scrawled in cursive. They never listened to the whispers. Raymond Hale didn't look like a killer. That was the first sentence in the local paper the day after his arrest. A quiet man with soft eyes and a respectable mustache. He was the kind of face that blended into crowds, an old-timer who tipped baristas and kept to himself. But inside that modest Idaho cabin, the evidence told a different story. The FBI called it a shrine to silence. Every surface in the basement had been scrubbed, spotless walls painted the exact shade of forest moss. No photos, no decorations. Just one thing stood out. A long, narrow corkboard mounted at eye level. Pinned to it were maps, dozens of them, all centered on Pine Bridge. Marked in red ink were winding trails, back roads, old water lines. Each location lined up with a woman who had disappeared, been stalked, or died under mysterious circumstances between 1991 and 2007. And next to every name, one word: listen. The whisperer had kept notes. One agent found a locked metal box beneath a false floor panel. Inside were 8 cassette tapes labeled only by date. When the first was played, the room fell silent. March 11th. She heard me, froze, didn't scream. I whispered again. Still here, still here. Breathing sounds, not ready yet. On another tape, recorded 6 years later, she opened the door. Let me stand there. I wanted to see what she'd do. She smiled. I didn't. Experts confirmed the voice matched Raymond Hale's. Calm, even, never angry. It was the detachment that made it chilling. Forensic linguists, criminologists, and psychologists pored over the audio. One conclusion became clear. The whisper didn't kill for rage. He killed for ritual. The FBI timeline placed Hale's first activity in Pine Bridge shortly after his dishonorable discharge from the Army in 1990. He had served in a logistics and demolition unit during the late stages of the Cold War. No combat, but a psychologist's note from his file, long sealed, mentioned paranoid ideation and compulsive control tendencies. No one had connected the dots. After his discharge, Hale drifted west. For a time, he worked as a firefighter, his role giving him access to homes, tools, and routes few others knew. He'd even assisted in the initial search for Kimberly Voss, the second known victim. That irony would haunt Pine Bridge for decades. But there was one problem. The DNA matched the attack on Eleanor Keats. The handwriting matched the 1990s notes. The tapes matched his voice, yet he refused to confess. No emotion, no denial, just silence. Every time an agent entered the room, Hale stared straight ahead, eyes fixed on a spot above their head, as if listening to something no one else could hear. Eventually, the court-appointed psychiatrist offered a theory. He believes in the purity of what he did. The pine cones, the notes, the whispered words, they were his language. Speaking with us would cheapen that. In his mind, we weren't worthy of the conversation. That philosophy was evident in the final tape. Dated March 3rd, 2007, the night before Eleanor Keats was murdered. She changed her name, moved far, thought she escaped. But names don't silence echoes. The forest remembers. They'll understand when they're quiet enough. In court, the prosecution had more than enough. DNA, audio, maps, notes, pattern. But the trial dragged on for 10 months. Hale's defense clinging to an insanity plea, arguing that his delusions invalidated intent. Pinebridge residents came to every hearing. Victims' families stared him down. And yet, Hale never looked back. Not once. In June 2009, the verdict came, guilty. 11 counts of first-degree murder, 3 of attempted abduction. Sentence, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. But for many, justice felt incomplete, because the FBI had only confirmed 11 cases, and there were 19 pine cones in the box. 8 were unaccounted for. No initials, no matching files, just dates. The last pine cone was dated March 4, 2007, the second to last, October 14, 2004, and the name next to it had no corresponding missing person, just 3 letters, C. Arbor. When FBI agent Lisa Monroe re-examined the evidence room in Boise, her eye kept drifting back to the wooden box, simple, aged, pine-worn. Inside, the 19 pine cones were lined in neat rows, each tied with a strip of black cloth and marked with a date or set of initials. 11 were already matched to victims, but that left 8, and one of them was marked with just 3 letters. C. Arbor. Date, October 14, 2004, had never appeared in any known missing persons list, never in local news archives. No reports matched the initials or date. It was as if C. Arbor never existed. Agent Monroe requested a full deep trace. Hospital records, DMV, church rosters, yearbooks, anyone with matching initials living near Pinebridge or the surrounding counties in 2004. 3 days later, something surfaced. Cassandra Ray Bloom, age 27. She'd lived in a rural rental cabin west of Larchfield, about 50 miles from Pinebridge. She was a landscape painter, known locally for her quiet personality and hiking habits. Her mail had piled up for a few days before the landlord noticed and reported her as missing. No foul play had been suspected at the time. The official report said she'd likely wandered into the forest during a depressive episode. The search lasted 3 weeks. Nothing was found. Until now, the discovery electrified the case. Monroe and local deputies reopened the Bloom file. They visited her old cabin. Remarkably, some of her paintings were still in storage, left unclaimed by distant relatives, and one of them caught Monroe's attention. It depicted a shadowed clearing in the woods, with faint outlines of trees and a small object in the foreground. On closer inspection, it was unmistakable, a pine cone bound with a black ribbon, painted weeks before her disappearance. Forensics brought in scent dogs and new LiDAR scans. 3 days into the new search, they found it, a shallow grave less than 600 yards from her cabin, wrapped in a green tarp. Inside, bones, long decomposed. The killer had returned to his early ritual. No note, no signature, just silence. DNA from dental records confirmed it was Cassandra Ray Bloom. With this discovery, the total number of confirmed Whisperer victims rose to 12. But something else emerged. In Cassandra's cabin, tucked inside a sketchbook, was a scrap of paper with half-erased handwriting. A name, not her own. It read, Alex. He said he knew. I shouldn't have told him about the notes. The forest listens. Who was Alex? And what did he know? Agent Monroe dug through town records and found only one Alex in Cassandra's known circle. Alex Brenner, a wildlife photographer who had lived nearby at the time. Strangely, he had died in a cabin fire 2 months after Cassandra went missing. His death had been ruled accidental, no foul play. But now, the fire had burned too hot. No evidence remained. Only one thing was ever recovered from the ashes: a melted voice recorder. Suddenly, a pattern emerged. 3 of the unmatched pine cones had dates that lined up with accidental deaths in Idaho forests. A hiker who slipped from a ravine in 1996. A camper who drowned in 2002, fully clothed. A forest ranger found crushed under a fallen log in 1999. All of them had something in common. They were alone. And near old sites Hale had once worked on as a wildfire consultant. The Pinecone Ledger wasn't just a list of victims. It was a confession, but only if you knew where to look. And yet, the most chilling discovery hadn't arrived. That came a week later, when Hale's prison cell was searched. Guards found a small square of fabric tucked beneath the mattress. It was black. It smelled faintly of pine, and written on it, in faded ink, 19 was never the end. Listen closer. By the time FBI agent Lisa Monroe processed the fabric found in Hale's prison cell, she was no longer looking at a cold case. This was an active threat. 19 was never the end. Listen closer. The whisperer was either hinting at more undiscovered victims, or worse, a copycat had picked up where Hale left off. A new development came from an unexpected source. Audio enhancement specialists at Quantico were able to partially extract corrupted data from the charred voice recorder found in Alex Brenner's cabin fire 20 years earlier. Most of the tape was static, but one brief clip was intact. A man's voice, hoarse, whispering. He watches at dawn, never speaks, just records. Click, silence. Then a female voice, frightened but defiant. I know you're out there. I see you. The timestamp matched 2 weeks before Cassandra Bloom disappeared. Monroe pulled in forensic audio experts, who discovered something subtle beneath the voice track. Not words, not music, breathing, deliberate, rhythmic, almost patterned. An audio tech converted it into waveforms and noticed the spacing, 17-second intervals, repeated 3 times. Then nothing. To anyone else, that might have seemed meaningless. But Monroe had read Hale's psychiatric profile. In his high school years, he was obsessed with numbers and ritual breathing to remain unseen in the woods. It was a bizarre form of self-control he claimed allowed him to merge with the silence. What they'd found was a calling card, and this tape confirmed it wasn't just a story. A deeper dive into the pinecone evidence now took priority. Each pinecone wasn't just decorative, it was sourced. The black fabric TIs weren't store-bought. They were ripped from the same brand of surplus army raincoat, standard issue in the 1980s. But the one from 2004 had something different. Fragments of copper residue beneath the sap. Someone had handled it with metalworking gloves, the kind used by welders or fence repairmen. That detail matched none of Hale's known history. Was it possible someone else had joined him? Or had Hale been framed for some of the murders he didn't commit? Monroe considered a dark possibility. What if Hale inspired someone else, and that person had slipped past them for decades? One name resurfaced. Wendell Carr, a former forestry assistant Hale once worked with on an Oregon firebreak line in 1982, had gone off-grid in 1991. He was never questioned in the original case. His last known address? Elkhorn Ridge, 70 miles north of Pine Bridge, a ghost town of broken mines and moss-choked cabins. Agent Monroe and a tactical team approached under pretext of wildlife fire survey. What they found chilled them. Wendell Carr's property was long abandoned, but the shed was intact, padlocked from the inside. They breached it. Inside, dozens of pine cones on a table, a chart of dates, names, and GPS coordinates. A wall covered in newspaper clippings of missing persons from 1993 to 2011. One photo showed Monroe herself, printed from an online article. But Wendell Carr, gone. His trail ended at the bank of the Snake River, where a burned-out boat motor and boot prints vanished into mud. Back in Boise, Hale was questioned again. For the first time, he smiled. You think the forest only had one whisperer? Oh no, I was just the first one to speak. The whisperer wasn't just one man, it was a legacy, and someone, maybe more than one person, was still out there, hunting, listening, waiting for the next silent victim. The hunt had changed. What began as a cold case of a long-imprisoned predator had grown into something darker, a network, a philosophy, perhaps even a cult of silence operating under a single, haunting signature: the whisperer. FBI agent Lisa Monroe returned to the Elkhorn Ridge shed, this time with ground-penetrating radar. The soil around the cabin was disturbed in rectangular patterns, 6 shallow graves, expertly filled, camouflaged with moss and leaf litter. They unearthed 5 skeletons, each showing signs of post-mortem staging, clean surgical incisions, a pine cone clenched in the ribcage, one skull sealed with wax where the mouth had been. But one grave was empty, its edges still soft, fresh. Monroe believed they'd interrupted someone in the act. Meanwhile, digital forensics discovered an encrypted folder on the prison USB key smuggled out by Hale before his death. Inside, a single PDF. No images, just text. Dozens of pages. A manifesto, written in fragmented verses. It read like scripture. When silence returns to the body, it leaves behind a mark. Mark the pine. Mark the breath. Listen for the empty hour. At the end, a title. The second voice. Author. Unknown. But one line was underlined 3 times. He was never alone. Suddenly, the timeline made sense. The murders attributed to Hale continued after his arrest, sporadically but unmistakably. And the pine cones? Each one had unique chemical signatures in the sap, some from Oregon, others from Washington, few even from British Columbia. They weren't just tokens, they were breadcrumbs. Then came a breakthrough. A ranger in Cascade Locks, Oregon, reported a recent incident. A camper went missing near Bridge of the Gods, and all that was found in her tent was a pine cone and a small speaker. The speaker looped a soft, breathing rhythm, the same rhythm found in the audio tape from Brenner's fire 20 years ago. Monroe and her team descended on the area with dogs, drones, and forest patrol. Days passed, nothing, until one of the dogs found a stone marker in the moss, shaped like a triangle with a vertical slit, a symbol from Hale's manifesto. Below it, buried just 3 inches beneath the soil, a voice recorder sealed in plastic. She pressed play. You came looking, Agent Monroe. You listened. Now you'll see what the forest hides. Let the silence begin again. Then static. The FBI issued a national bulletin. Media frenzy exploded. The whisper lives on. Some called it a movement, others, a myth. But Monroe knew better. This wasn't a ghost story. It was the evolution of evil. A quiet inheritance passed between loners, survivalists, former soldiers, people no one remembered until it was too late. Hale was dead, but his voice, and those who embraced it, remain. Now, every pine tree seemed to breathe. Every silent trail carried an echo. And somewhere out there, the second voice was waiting.